Hello, everybody, and welcome to our virtual 67 Pall Mall, where we are running a series of webinars hosted by our friends, experts, and winemakers and sommeliers. Please take a look at our website under the events, where our dates and themes are being added daily, with most events having a tasting selection of 6 75ml bottles that are shipped to your door. Only within Europe at the moment, I'm afraid, but we are working to expand this globally very soon. As well as our current selection of wine, the team are working really hard to bring you many more exciting webinars, including wine writer Matthew Jukes tomorrow, presenting his favourite wines from Australia. And on Saturday, author Wink Lorch, live from the French Alps, who'll be explaining the Jura and its wines to us. Now it's a great pleasure to welcome Demetri Walters, MW, who is an educator and presenter, and following 18 years at Berry Brothers is now an independent consultant with a passion for fortified wines. We'll have 15 minutes at the end when Demetri has finished speaking, so you can ask questions all the way through. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see chat. Please chat in the box. Please tell us what you're drinking and where you're drinking it from. And if possible, stick it on social media with a photo with hashtag 67 from home. And also Q&A button down at the bottom. Please click on that and type your questions for Demetri there. So we hope you've got a nice glass of Madeira ready. And hello, Demetri.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Ronan.
Hey, thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Demetri's Madeira is definitely one of those things that I'd rank up there as some of the world's greatest wines. So I think we're really looking forward to this.
And famed for being the world's longest lived wine.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you again. And yeah, please, over to you.
Hello all, and thanks very much for spending time with me. I have many Venus passions, of which Madeira is one. There's nothing quite like a wine that ages in your cellar, that you can appreciate, that you can drink from time to time, assuming you buy enough of the said wine. Madeira is a wine you can just forget about. And I've been lucky enough, through being a member of the Madeira Club, through being invited to Patrick Grubb's tastings, through working at Berry Brothers, through being someone who enjoys fortified wines, I've been lucky enough to taste widely, but also taste some spectacularly old wines. But before I go any further, I want to have a glass of wine with you to celebrate St. George's Day, very much associated with the enjoyment of fortified wine. Cheers, happy St. George's Day. Now, the tasting I'm going to conduct is going to be a bit different from some of the others you've seen. I've been asked to talk about Madeira, which, albeit a very small market, a very small island, I've been asked to talk about the whole thing. The island, its geography, its topography, its history, the socioeconomic situation, the trade, the producers, and 6 wines. And I've got an hour, I think, all told. So I'm going to use slides. So this is going to be a little bit like a classroom. Those of you who've done enough school today, you can just go and do whatever you have to do and drink along with me and occasionally revisit. So I'm going to show you some slides now. Now, I hope you can all see that. Obviously, Ronan, if something is going wrong, you can just tell me. This is a very typical scene.
Looks great. Looks great so far, Demetri.
This is a very typical scene of Madeira. It really is a land of cliffs. And for those of you who are keen gardeners, as I am, this is Echinum fastuosum growing wild on the cliffs of the southern shores of Madeira. But where is it? Some of you will have been there. Many of you will not have been there. So it's part of metropolitan Portugal. It's 500 miles west of Morocco, not really part of Europe at all. It's tiny, 57 kilometers from east to west, and just over 20 north to south, 730 square kilometers. Now, Porto Santo, which is part of the whole group of islands, is the other inhabited island, and that's northeast of Madeira. It was the first to be discovered, and there are also 2 other large islands that are bird sanctuaries. There we are. There it is. Follow my little blinky. So here down here we have the Canaries, also famed for wine, part of Spain. And up here we have the Azores, also part of Portugal. And this is a close-up. Many of the vineyards are down in the south, particularly the red grapes. I'm going to get onto this. This is going to be a real classroom. So those grapes that require more ripening do better in the warmer, sunnier south. And many grapes, such as Verdelho and Cercial, are often planted in the north. But contrary to what you may have heard, certain varieties don't only grow in one region, although Malvasia is mainly on the south coast, and there's a very large concentration of it round here, Câmara de Lobos. What's the climate like? Well, subtropical. It's very far south in the northern hemisphere, and the climate is largely determined by these northwesterly anticyclonic systems that come in from the Azores. They bring in heat during the summer, but also occasionally you get bursts of extreme heat that come across from the Sahara. It doesn't usually last long, but those bursts of extreme heat can raise the temperature over a few days by about 10 centigrade. That's quite something. Otherwise, the climate is quite temperate, and there are cooling effects from being in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But what makes Madeira different from other wine-growing regions, except perhaps if you're from the Hunter Valley, you'll recognize this, it has a low cloud base for much of the year, particularly in the center of the island. So the south of the island, which I showed you on the map before, is the warmest part. The annual temperature about 19.5 centigrade. That's pretty high. Madeira doesn't get very cold, neither does it get very warm. The average temperature in the north is about 2.5 degrees cooler, about 17. In the south, you don't get so much precipitation, about 500 mil a year. In the north, about 1,200, an awful lot more. Humidity is high as a result on Madeira, and in the interior, up to 3 meters a year. That's an awful lot. So humidity runs at about 69%, which is a lot. You'd imagine that that might cause certain viticultural problems. Most of the vineyards are planted within sight of the ocean, or quite close to the ocean. So it's history. The Portuguese, and I know there are some Portuguese friends of mine watching tonight, you have to forgive me my pronunciation during the course of the evening, but the Portuguese claim that Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese Infante, discovered the island, or sent agents to discover the island in 1420, 2 years before Porto Santo had been discovered, and they saw a haze on the horizon about 30 kilometers away. Thus, allegedly, Madeira was discovered. However, with the best laid plans, etc., it did appear already in the Pinelli chart, for instance, and the Medici Atlas. So perhaps it had already been discovered, but it wasn't colonized until the Spanish made a concerted effort to colonize it from about 1430. And Portuguese nobility were awarded land rights. And as a result, Madeira became a little bit like Portugal itself, with the same laws, the same social hierarchy, and the agricultural terracing began mid-century, and the levadas, the famous water channels, bringing water from the wet interior down to the drier coast, particularly the south coast. Those levadas still exist. Land rights were awarded to Portuguese and to foreign settlers, including, more recently, English settlers. But most of the farming wasn't done by the Portuguese. A lot of it in the early years was African and Arab slaves. So there was an abundance of labor, and very, very cheap labor it was too. And as a result of this slave labor, sugar, or sugar cane, which was a great commodity of the period, became the staple. More recently, and if you go to Madeira now, you imagine it's going to be covered in vineyards. It's not. It's covered in bananas. So if you like bananas, go to Madeira. Farmers from northern Portugal brought their vines with them, brought their know-how with them, and many of the grapes in northern Portugal and their associated grapes, and also the know-how, the way of growing grapes, still exists on Madeira today. And it's very much a Portuguese culture. Christopher Columbus, remember the story? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, he did, and he stopped here on his way to revictual his ships. In the early part of the 16th century, Italians came over, which is why many older Madeira names are Lomelino, Acciaioli, and by the mid-16th century, so by about 1550, about a third of the prominent families were foreign, were not Portuguese. In terms of its link with this country, in about 1537, but it was regularly being drunk during the end of the Tudor period in the time of Elizabeth I, and along with nearby Spanish Canary. So at about this time, during the 16th century, the 17th century, the wine we know now in terms of style, maybe not in manufacture, was beginning to take shape. And people liked the Vinho da Roda, the wine that tasted as if it had been aged in the hull of a seagoing ship. So this process began to be emulated on Madeira in special heated lodges, estufas. So following Port's lead, and I'm going to talk about fortification a bit later, Madeira also began to be fortified from the mid-18th century. If you're lucky enough to taste an early 18th century Madeira, firstly, give me a call. I'll come over and make sure it's okay. Secondly, those wines were not originally fortified. They were fortified retrospectively. By the middle of the century, it had become quite normal for Madeira to be fortified. Certainly by the end of the 18th century, both Port and Madeira were universally fortified. The addition of grape spirit to make the wine stable. Why fortify at all? Well, remember that cloud cover on Madeira, particularly above 300 or 400 meters. There's an awful lot of cloud, except in the middle of summer. So natural grape sugars struggle to reach 11.5 degrees. There are certain places on the island where it's not a problem to hit 12 degrees with grapes like Verdelho, for instance. So with a grape that doesn't have high levels of sugar and rendering the wine perhaps a little bit lean, and this desire to produce a wine that is oxidized and tastes like a long sea voyage wine, the process of fortification came into use, rendering those wines that were sent to sea to create a particular style of wine, but also to feed Portuguese and various Portuguese and British tastes, British colonial tastes abroad. This wine became very popular, this style of wine. In order to make it stable, grape spirit was added. As a result, grape spirit was added at various different stages, which I'll explain again later. And when you arrest the fermentation by adding lots of grape spirit, you end up with different levels of residual sugar in the wine, but the wine is then stable. No microbes, so no yeast, no bacteria can affect the wine, and the wine is better able to withstand long aging oxidatively. Depending upon the desired style that you as a producer want, the length of the fermentation will be shorter or longer. The longer the fermentation, the less residual sugar in the resulting wine. So the sooner you fortify, the sooner you add this 96% grape spirit, the sweeter the wine will be. There'll be more unresolved or unfermented sugars. So residual sugar levels, let's call them RS levels, range from about 50 grams per liter of sugar up to about 130 or a little bit more, with an average alcohol by volume of about 19 to 20%. Good news, huh? Maturation is by two methods, either accelerated in an estufa to, I suppose, ape what was happening in those ships, those Vinho da Roda wines, or using ambient temperature in quintas, in lodges, as cantero. A small production of Vinho Seco, or unfortified light table wine, is also made. This is what estufas look like. In years gone by, there used to be armagem de calor. There used to be rooms with heated water pipes inside them. Nowadays, you see something a bit like a steel vat or a cement vat, and the wine is heated up. I'll get onto that in a moment. But the process of estufagem, or the way of making wine in an estufa, certainly began here. It began mainly with the involvement of the British trade. During the late 17th, early 18th century, Madeira was often heated in stoves or hot rooms, sometimes at the top of people's houses. And on the island itself, it became common for producers to accelerate the wine's aging, particularly with their wines they wanted to get onto the market very quickly to create that desired vinho da roda, that sea voyage flavor. Just imagine if you're a barrel of wine slopping around way down in the bowels of the ship in the orlop deck, it's going to be pretty warm and pretty humid. And estufa, or estufa gem, can copy that, can synthesize that. So all merchants very, very quickly had their own estufas. And they used these for their lesser wines, the wines they wanted to get up to the market very quickly, and sometimes to bring on their cantero wines, the wines that were designed for longer aging. The institute that governs everything to do with quality control of Madeira, let's call it IVBAM or IVBAM, they will come along nowadays, and once you've made your Madeira, so you've made the light wine, you've stopped the fermentation at the desired level, you've added your fortification spirit and arrested the fermentation, the wine is then rendered sweet after a fashion. This is known as vinho claro. This is unaged fortified wine. So IVBAM come along, they put a seal on the tank. Over the course of 3 months, the wine is heated, and it varies according to the producers, to the shippers, between 40 and 50 centigrade for about 3 months. Now, that's a pretty warm bath. I think you'd want to get out quite quickly. Over the course of 3 months, the wine is baked to a degree, and it takes on the flavor of those vinho da roda, those wines that used to be shipped to the East Indies, the West Indies, to the American colonies, to the Portuguese colonies like Brazil, or to the East Indian colonies of Portugal. After 3 months, IVBAM come along, they remove the seals, take samples for analysis, and the wine, as an estufa wine, can't be released onto the market until it's 6 months old. Of course, these wines are then blended, which is why they're known as blends, not just because there's sometimes more than one grape, because most of them are one grape, usually Tinta Negra, or the great majority of them are mostly Tinta Negra, but sometimes they use other grapes too. But they blend between years, and a bit like with Tawny Port, you arrive at an average age, a 3-year-old blend, a 5-year-old blend. Those are usually made by producers in an estufa. With this particular producer we're dealing with tonight, De Oliveira's, all the wines tonight are by De Oliveira's, supplied by Bovy Wines. They also put their 10s and 15s through the estufa process. If it's an unaged estufa wine, a wine without an average age, this is a wine possessing no age, and these are becoming increasingly rare. They're really for culinary purposes. You sometimes find older bottlings of them, and they're quite interesting, sometimes quite good, but nowadays they're usually known as salt and pepper, and they're used for culinary purposes. They're not allowed to be drunk. I bet they are though. So wine number one, we're going to have the tasting during the school. The first wine really tells you a little bit about the taste of an estufa wine. This is a 5-year-old blend, so it's made from different components of Tinta Negra, almost 100%, maybe even 100% here, that have been aged in an estufa through the estufa gem method. So you might have components that are less than 5, some a bit more, but the average age is 5. And this is made in a medium dry style. So this isn't like the grapes you might know, Cercial, Verdelho, Boal and Malvasia, where you know the sweetness style. Tinta Negra can be made in any style you want it to be made in. This is actually a Verdelho style. So medium dry, about 70 grams of residual sugar, unfermented sugar. 10-year-old blends, whether they go through the estufa or not, often they don't, are often made from one of the classic grapes, including Tinta Negra, a red grape, which became considered a noble variety in 2014. But 10-year-old blends might be made from Verdelho, Cercial. Anyway, this outfit, Pereira de Oliveira, and ever you go to Madeira, you must go and visit them and have a tasting. They use Tinta Negra entirely or as a base for their blends, 3, 5s, 10s, and 15s. Have a go at that. I think we can spit all of these wines in. This is going to be a high octane tasting, and why not on St. George's Day? So this is the wine that will taste the least oxidative. It spent the least time out of the wines you're going to try in wood. It spent 3 months in the estufa and then would have gone into wood. Those different barrels would have been topped up, because the angels take their share, about 4% a year evaporates. And as a result, there's constant topping up. And when the wine is bottled, they deem it an average of 3 years or 5 years, or whatever the average is in the consignment of different barrels they want to blend together. Because this has only been in barrel an average of 5 years, it's the most grapey of the wines you're tasting tonight, the most fruity and medium dry in flavor. The thing about Madeira, even when it's very sweet, it never comes off sweet. There's always a dryness because the acidity, or the perception of acidity, is so high. Look at the color. Let me find the camera. There we are. It's got a red hue, hasn't it? Made from a red grape, Tinta Negra. Most other Madeira is made from white grapes, and we'll get onto this. I hope you like that. I think for a 5-year-old blend, that's really excellent. And gosh, you could drink that on almost any occasion. Drink it when you would drink any other oxidized or oxidative sweet wine or semi-sweet wine. Drink it when you're watching a bit of telly, eating some almonds, some walnuts. Drink it at tea time with or instead of tea. Who knows? I wanted to show you during the course of this slideshow the vineyards. Can you see up here above the house to the right of the photograph? Look at these vineyards. They are pretty steep, aren't they? So a small number of vineyards here on this ledge. This great basaltic cliff above. This is a very dramatic landscape. Earlier you had a tasting with Prüm, and in the Mosel, vineyards are invariably, particularly the more famous vineyards, inaccessible. They're very, very steep. Well, a lot of Madeira is no exception. The terrain, the soil, well, you saw that photograph. Madeira is an extinct, let's hope, volcanic plug rising to, what's that? That must be about 7,500 feet, 1,800 meters, about 7,000 feet above sea level. However, that's the part you see. 3/5 of this mountain actually go down below the waves. So it is an enormous mountain rising up from the seafloor. It's a big basaltic, big volcanic plug. And almost 50% of the land area is above 700 meters. That's 2,000 feet. And about 80% of the coastline consists of cliffs. And many of these are over 100 meters. Cabo Girau is 600 meters, just about. It's one of the 6 highest sea cliffs in the world. So if your joy in life is base jumping in a squirrel suit, this is the place for you, but don't forget the wine. The base geological soils are volcanic, as you would have guessed. So basaltic at lower altitudes, above them, they're sort of gray and red, but above them, the dark gray trachytes, that contain lots of silicates, and they're above 300 meters, and higher than them, you find trachydolerites, so trachytes mixed with dolerite soil. And throughout the island, you find volcanic mud, tufa, or tufa, depending on how you pronounce it. The best soils, though, in this volcanic terrain, because volcanic soil has very high potential, very high vigor in the potential vigor in the soil. The best soils are those that are gravelly and stony with enough organic matter to sustain the vine. So free draining, but not too vigor inducing in the vine. Otherwise, you end up with a whole lot of triffids. Look at that. That's a photograph I took near the vineyard of Fajo dos Padres. And this must be about 150 meters, 200 meters above the sea. I wouldn't like to harvest there, and I like climbing. Can you see those vines just clinging on for dear life? This is very typical of Madeira. So the grapes. First off, there's 5,500 hectares of vineyards. That's not true. There are 5,400 hectares of land which is cultivatable to cane, bananas, vegetables, whatever you're growing, soft fruit, of which 480, only 480, that's right, only 480 hectares of Madeira is planted to vines. So all these famous wines, you wonder why they're in small supply. Well, that's the reason. The main variety is that red grape that we tried with wine number 1, Tinta Negra. It used to be called Tinta Negra Mol, nowadays just Tinta Negra. So more than half the island is planted to Tinta Negra. The best known styles of Madeira, however, are named after the noble grapes. The styles are named after the grapes from which they come. So Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, Malvasia. But these only constitute about 10% of production. More in terms of plantation, but only 10% of production. They are low yielding vines. There are also some rare and very high quality grapes, which are produced mainly as varietal wines or grapes on their own. Moscatel, Muscat. Mostarda, which is Trousseau, for those of you who love the wines of the Jura, and Terrantejo. These are produced in very, very small quantities. Mostarda is about 1.5 hectares in total, Terrantejo about 1.7. Moscatel, a little bit more than those two. So they are very, very well thought of, sought after wines. The reason they're not more planted is mainly because of phylloxera. Back in the 19th century, phylloxera swept the island, which it did with most of the world, and wiped out most of those vines. They are highly susceptible. They weren't replanted in the same way, and they're very low yielding. Other recommended grapes for making fortified wine, the great majority of production, all the light wines, such as Verdelho Tinta, a red grape like Mostarda, Tinta de Madeira, red, Malvasia Candida Rocha, red, as well as some authorized grapes, such as Caracol, Crossings, which is a white. Isn't that pretty? So this is very near Barbeto, very near the winery of Ricardo. And this is looking out to the south coast. Can you see the vineyards in the distance? This patchwork of little tiny vineyards all over here. Now, there are about 1,470 producers on Madeira and 480 hectares of land, which means on average about, what, 1/3 of a hectare per vineyard. Not much, is it? Or 1/3 of a hectare per grower. So these are a tiny patchwork, and most producers will have agents to help them buy grapes from all these different producers. The second wine is the second level in the hierarchy and an area that is growing. This, you'll see, has a vintage, a year of harvest on it. It's a single harvest wine. And that is Colheita, single harvest. And this is Malvasia, the sweetest style and the sweetest grape, the grape that produces the most sugar. This is Malvasia Candida, or Malvasia. You sometimes see it bottled as Malvasia. It's anachronistic and rather charming. Malvasia itself is a word that comes from Monemvasia in Greece. Of course, I would say this, but Monemvasia, the Byzantine fortress town of Monemvasia in the Peloponnesus, used to be a great shipping port for sweet wines. And Genoese and Venetian and British consumers would call this style of wine Malvasia, much easier to say Malvasia, or even in England, Malmsey. So Malvasia candida is a descendant of that Greek grape, and this is grown mainly on the south coast. A lot of it around Camera de Lobos. This is a white grape. You find a lot of this grown in Greece and Italy. And I'm sure you've had it if you've been down to Sicily and the Aeolian Islands, where excellent Malvasia is produced. So this wine, whilst it's vintage, and it says 2000, which was 20 years ago, this was bottled last year. So this is not the top level of vintage wine. This is not a frasquera or garrafera. This is a colheita, which is one level below. This means that the wines have to be at least 5 years old from a single vintage, a maximum of 19 years old. Have you tasted this already? Have a go now. Can you taste the step up in quality? It has those typically aged Madeira flavors, aged in wood for the best part of 18 and a half years. It has those high-toned, it's a great expression that describes the polished nature, that slightly polishy flavor of Madeira. It's also very figgy and datey. It has sort of dried fruit character. So this wine would have been fortified or reinforced quite early on in its fermentation to arrest the fermentation and keep upwards of 120 grams of residual sugar. I think this is every bit as good as a frasquera, but D'Oliveira's, for one reason or another, have decided to call this a colheita. And I think this is a very successful wine. You can enjoy drinking now, but if for some reason you forget about it in your cupboard, in your cellars, with your wine merchant for another 10, 20, 30, 40, however long you've got, years, it'll only get better. Remember that vineyard patchwork we saw before? That's where some of the grapes would have come from. Malvasia likes being close to the sea. It produces quite a lot of sugar. It needs a lot of ripening. It needs to be in the south. So perhaps the most historic of all the grapes on the island, Malvasia candida, which was knocked around very badly by disease, by oidium, but also it was quite difficult to grow. Now it's making a comeback, but these wines are still pretty rare. Colheita style wines, though, are on the increase, and you can see why. It's excellent, isn't it? This is how vineyards look. These sticks at low level on the left photograph, at high level on the right. Yes, that's an amaryllis growing wild in the vineyard. These are called latadas, and latadas basically mean a pergola. I grow a pergola vine in Cyprus, but you can't even touch it with your hand above your head. The vine on the right, you could just about crawl under, and that's only because it's early spring. So difficult to harvest those unless you grow them a little bit higher. The left-hand side, that latada, that sprawl, if you will, it's actually quite difficult, but it's the traditional way of growing grapes. And both of these encourage polyculture, which is still very common on Madeira. The idea that you can grow other things you need alongside the vines, beans, melons, you name it, whatever you want to grow. This is more modern. Recognize this? This is modern trellising. Again, if you're keen gardeners, this is Hottentot fig that has somehow found its way into the vineyard. It's an invasive weed in this part of the world, and they do well to keep that back. It can grow anywhere. Here, lashed by salt spray, it has no problem at all. But this is modern trellising, facing south, facing where most of the light comes from. This is probably a Malvasia vineyard, quite possibly. So the wine styles, and this is a quinta. This is a lodge with wines aging in the cantera method, the method of aging in ambient temperature, whether it's a warm summer, cool winter, dry spell, humid spell. So this is the second method of aging wine, rather than accelerating the aging in an estufa. Just a recap of the wine styles. We have the blends. These are blends of different casks, and you create an average age based on the average of those casks. And these are wines that are often made in an estufa, sometimes cantero. Usually, with most producers, the 3s and 5s are estufas, made in the estufa gem system, and the 10s and 15s are sometimes made in an estufa, but the 20s, 30s, 40s or older are always made in the cantero system. So the blends can be a glorious thing, a really, really senior wine made from a blend of different casks from different vintages, therefore different ages. So don't get this idea that blends are cheap. They can be, but they're frequently not. You then have the vintage wine. Vintage wines are all made in the cantero system. The aging in wood, which is an imperative on Madeira, in ambient temperature in the lodge. And you start with Colheita, which we've just had. So these are a single harvest wine, matured in cantero, and benefiting from seasonal variation in temperature and humidity. These are matured in wood for 5 to 19 years. The one you just had was 19 years old before it was bottled. They can be an unstated blend, up to 10% of the total production of that house, an unstated blend with dry, medium dry, whatever style you make the wine in, particularly if it's from Tinta Negra, or they can be a stated variety, like Tinta Negra, like Cercial, like Verdelho. You then have the really serious vintage wines. These are called Garrafera or Frasqueira, and these again are wood-aged varietal wines. So they're made from one variety, and they're matured in wood for at least 20 years. They have to be 20 years old to be considered a vintage or Frasqueira wine. And these are above and beyond cantero in their concentration, the profoundness of flavor, the patience of the winemaker in terms of the wood aging, and they often spend significant time, 25, 30, 40 years or more in wood before either being bottled, but usually going into large glass demijohn. You then have Solera. What is Solera? Well, you find Solera all over the world. We know what it is from sherry. It's fractional blending, and this is no exception, except Solera here means that you're allowed to draw off the first time you dip into the cask, you're allowed to draw off 10% and replace that with something of similar quality. You're then allowed to dip into the cask 9 more times. Which sounds quite a lot, doesn't it? So by the time you bottle the wine in its final incarnation, how much of the original vintage is left? Not much. For those of you who are collectors, there are quite a few 1815 Soleras knocking around at the moment, and I would hazard a guess that there's not that much 1815 inside them. But 1815s usually are Soleras for some reason. I would say if you want to spend your money, an awful lot of money, on a very old Madeira, perhaps a Frasqueira is a better bet. But Solera are very, very interesting wine, and they are not cheap. They can be spectacularly good as well. So we have the blends, the vintage wines starting with Cantero, and then we have the Frasqueira, Garrafera wines, which are a senior version of the Colheita, sorry. And both the Colheita and the Frasqueira are aged in ambient temperatures in a lodge, so the Cantero method, and the same with the Solera method. These are the classic grape varieties. Cercial, classified as dry to off-dry. Let's face it, those of you who are wine students out there, if you're doing a blind tasting and the wine has no residual sugar, it is not going to be Madeira. There are no technically dry fortified Madeira. They start at about 49, 50 grams of residual sugar, up to about 65. Cercial has the highest acidity, certainly the highest sense of acidity, quite limey, citrusy, biting acidity. Not for nothing is it called Dog Strangler. Verdelho. Verdelho is the next famous grape, if you will, the next classic grape, classified as medium dry, from about 65 up to about 80 grams. This sounds quite sweet, but these are wines with very high acidity. You barely notice it. Cercial has this lovely citrusy character. I find Verdelho, and we're going to taste them together, those of you who have the wines, reminds me very much of marmalade. It doesn't have so much dried fruit character. The dried fruit character generally starts with boal, either B-U-A-L or B-O-A-L, and this is otherwise known as Malvasia fina. And this is classified as medium sweet, 80 grams up to about 95, 96. Often tastes figgy, datey, raisiny, sort of fruitcake character. And guess what it goes with? It goes excellently with fruitcake. Works as a dessert wine, works as a wine of contemplation, works as a wine you just want to have in that moment. Malvasia candida, these are full, rich Madeiras, 95 grams plus, up to about 130 grams of residual sugar. There are some that are sweeter, and as the years go by, climate change and improved viticulture, they're getting a little bit sweeter at the top end. These are the stylistic descendants of medieval Malmsey wine. George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Richard III, got to know a butt of Malmsey wine better than he banked on, and he had plenty of it soon enough and was drowned in one in the Tower of London. You know the story. Terrantej, very rare, just 1.7 hectares, similar in style to Verdelho. Bastardo can be drier, like Cercial, fun enough, but is usually quite full rich, as is Moscatel. Tinta Negra, considered a named variety since 2014, can be, in terms of style, really whatever you want it to be. Wine 3, just looking at the time. I'll get my skates on, Ronan. We're starting here, the Frasqueira hierarchy of the tasting. And look at this, that's quite a dark color for a Frasqueira, for a Cercial rather. This is 1989. Now, I selected all these wines to be, one, good, indicative of the style and the grape, but also to be affordable. I didn't want to show wines, partly because Ronan would have stamped on it, but I didn't want to show wines that would cost you £200-300 a bottle. For a wine that has aged this long, 30 years, this is, gosh, £60, something like that, from Bovey Wines. This is the drier style of Madeira. They're never technically dry. These start at about 49, 50 grams of residual sugar. Escano cow is what it's known as on the island, or dog strangler. Have a go at this and you'll know why. Feel the acidity. It's biting, isn't it? You get that high-toned flavor, that slightly polishy flavor, but you get citrus as well. If you make your own marmalade and you've used a little too little sugar, this is what it can taste like. And Cercial has that Seville orange, that marmalade character, high acidity, has all the hallmarks of a high-quality grape and can age almost indefinitely. The oldest Cercial that I've enjoyed was one that I bought myself from Patrick Grubb when he was trading, and that was an 1803. This is the story of Madeira. It was a delightful wine. I recorked it because at Berries we had that equipment for recorking. The recorking equipment, I think, was about the same age. And I recorked it and drank it a few months later with a very heavy ullage. That's the gap between the wine and the cork. Like this wine here, the ullage, or the level of the wine is there. The ullage was like that. And it had been for decades. And it didn't bother me at all because Madeira is the Venus undead. It's Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and various other horror characters all rolled into one. Everything that's going to die in it, going to be knocked out by oxidation, has already happened. These wines defy oxygen, and Cercial is no exception. So that 1803 was spectacular. I drank it over about 6 weeks, and I thought, what was going on in 1803? Well, Napoleon had spent a long time in Egypt and couldn't get back because at the Battle of the Nile, Nelson sank virtually his entire fleet, which scuppered his plans, or Napoleon's plans to conquer India, a wine of great history. This one is a mere snip, 1989, but compared to light wines, this is just getting into its stride. Nowadays, we live in an age where producers are bottling their Frasqueira younger than they used to, a minimum of 20 years, but quite often they bottle them at 25, 30. Even 15 years ago, they were bottling at above 40 years. Supply isn't increasing, but the demand is. Wood aging, I've spoken about it a lot. What is important about wood aging? Well, everything. The process of oxygen coming through the pores of the wood and rearranging all the various aroma and flavor compounds in the wine, and also creating a different texture on the planet, on the palate, oxidizing various compounds, various phenolic compounds and tannins, changing the color pigments, the anthocyanins, changing the aroma and flavor compounds through gentle oxidation. We as humans can't replicate it adequately. So wood is still the best vessel for doing that. And can you see on the left-hand photograph, that sort of fibrous material that the cooper is putting between this barrel that he's rebuilding, reassembling? That's banana leaves, which makes the wine barrel even more impervious to oxygen and also leakage. And the wine could spend the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years or more in that barrel, or in barrels rather than one barrel. The angel share. The angels do very well in Scotland. They do just as well on Madeira. They get about 4% a year from the producers, which is an awful lot. So rather than taking out the barrels, rather than pumping out a barrel and topping it up, you go around with the proceeds of one barrel that's gone down quite low, and you put it inside that big container, which will hold at least a barrel's worth, and you top up other barrels of the same vintage, same grape, and that's how it's done. And here is another shot of a cantero, or part of a lodge, part of a quinta, and this is at Brandy's. Rather beautiful, isn't it, watching these barrels slumber. The wine could be slumbering inside these barrels for as much as 80, 100 years. Maybe not so much nowadays, but in the past, it was common for wines to spend 60, 80 years in barrel before going into demijohn, before going into bottle. And Madeira, if it spends long enough in bottle, also needs decanting. All these wines were bottled in the last 3 years, so they won't cast a sediment. Anyway, words about that a little bit later. Let's try something similar in acidity to Cercial, but similar in style to Verdelho, and that is Terantej. And Terantej is very high in acidity, but usually made in a slightly sweeter style than Verdelho. Just to remind you, only 1.7 hectares in totality of Terantej planted on the island, only 2,000 litres produced in totality on the island, and not all houses produce this wine because there's so little of it. So 2,000 litres out of a total production of 3.5 million litres. This is a rare beastie. It's a very low cropper as well. The good news is it's gently on the increase, and some of the very best bottles I've had from the 19th century, the early 20th century, and quite a few Donavirus bottles from the last 40 years have been from Terantej. Have a go. Again, another white grape. The sense of acidity is searing, very much like the dog straggler, like the Cercial. And this is quite limey like Cercial, but it has a greater richness, a slightly more marmalade character. like the Verdelho, a little bit less high-toned than the Cercial, slightly more gentle at this stage. This particular bottle isn't going to last because I'm enjoying it. But if you had this in your cellar or wherever you keep your wine, let's face it, most of us don't have cellars. I'm in my 50s and I still use my parents' cellar. Isn't that sad? So this is a wine that will outlive all of us. Put 2 or 3 of us together and it could still last that long. This is a wine that can last 100 years, 150 years, no problem at all, thanks to that concentration, that complexity, that searing acidity. What an excellent wine. And the good news about Madeira is you open it, you put it in decanter, get some decent glass wherever you haven't got some, you don't have to drink it. Even with Tawny Port, I feel, God, I really ought to drink this in the next 2 or 3 weeks, which is, if you're busy, it's not long. With Madeira, not long at all. This could last, even with an open bottle, a year. It's not a problem. At a Madeira club tasting I was hosting some years ago at Berry's, I remember tasting a bottle of wine from 1896. It was a Boal, and it had been made with some rather nasty wood way back when it was made. And my colleagues were saying it's cork taint, and I said, it's not. It's actually just not clean wood. And we came around to the same way of thinking. Once the wine had been decanted, 3 or 4 days later, we tasted it. Then the club tasting came along. I remember having an inch and a half in a bottle on my table, one of the great things about the wine trade, on my desk, and went back to it with my colleagues a year later. It was spectacular. It hadn't moved. Anyway, enough reminiscing about ancient bottles. But you find when you get into Madeira, you become obsessed by ageability. So demijohn, what are they? In France, they call them bonbon. If you're a big fan of Rivesaltes, Mori, Banyuls, you'll know about bonbon, the big glass jars. Increasingly, when you go to a new restaurant, you see them decorating the place. Sometimes they're colored. Usually they're in clear glass, in baskets. And my grandfather in Cyprus used to use these for bottling up wine as well. They're quite normal in a more old-fashioned, rustic wine society. Just imagine you're losing a lot of wine to the angels. You then have too little to leave in barrel, but you have too much after topping up to leave in that barrel. So you put some into a glass jar to protect it, into demijohn, because there'd be too big an ullage in the barrel, too big a gap, too much oxygen. That's one use for demijohn. Another use, as well as being handy as a mini barrel, is once you've taken the wine out of barrel, because it tastes right at that stage to start thinking about bottling, you can put some of it, because you may only have some of it left after the angels have taken their share, into these demijohn. And in museum stock or library stock, which we have in the right-hand photograph, that's all the house have left. That's at Blandis as well. That could be all you have left to show to your guests, your family, your friends, when vulturous MWs arrive and want to taste the wine with you. Also, you might even bottle up some of these larger demijohn as a very late library stock release. So the different uses of a demijohn. But prior to bottling in 75 cl bottles, they're what Madeira spends time in, mostly, or the Frasqueira wines. Here are the producers and shippers. Some years ago, Pereira de Oliveira, so Luis Pereira, bought Barros and Souza, who were a nearby producer, but not a shipper, didn't have a license to ship. He bought their quinta and their stock, and took over some of the management of the various vineyard producers. Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong. But here are the producers, but not necessarily shippers. They're cooperative. I don't think they've released anything onto the market yet. Again, I may be wrong. They're new, and they have new wines still aging. Consalves are a patadista, a producer, but not licensed to ship. And then we have the shippers. We have Barbeto, who are one of the very best producers. Of course, there are very few producers. They're all good, but I think very forward-thinking. producing excellent wines. Blandis, excellent again, the oldest. Borges, producing a wide variety of wines for all wallets and styles and tastes. They are the largest producer. No, they're not, talking rubbish. Giustino, the largest producer. Borges, getting above myself here. Borges have a lot of the oldest library stock. Some of the best bottlings I bought via Patrick Grubb have been from Borges. But Giustino are the largest producer, offering some of the styles that other producers don't produce. Borges, I think, started in the late 19th century. Blandis in the early 19th century, one of the original old producers left. Henriques and Henriques, Portuguese amongst you, forgive my pronunciation. Henriques and Henriques on the rise. I think they're one to watch in terms of quality production and inspiration for something new. And here we have Pereira de Oliveira, who have, I think, the greatest stock of old wine. And also, Luis, please don't increase your prices, very reasonable prices. All the wines today from Pereira de Oliveira and available through Bovey Wines down in Cornwall and up in Leicestershire. Wine number 5, Ronan, we're almost there. Videlio. This is 1988.
Don't worry, Demetri. People are loving it, and the detail,
good.
The tension is fantastic. So please carry on.
What were we doing, Ronan, in 1988? Sadly, I was still adult. In 1988, gosh, that's 32 years ago, this grape, Videlio, was being grown, aka Folgaçao, another name for it on the island. This is, I think, the largest non-tinta production on the island. Folgaçao or Videlio, about 50 hectares in total. That doesn't say much though, because it's a very low cropper. As I've written down the bottom, it is not the same as Videlio or Gouveia in northern Portugal, in Vinho Verde. It produces wines of a medium dry style. You find quite a lot in the south, but it tolerates the cooler climate and the wetter climate of the north coast. So between 65 and 80 grams of residual sugar, and it has, as I was saying earlier, that bittersweet Seville orange marmalade character. Very food friendly, very gastronomic, like Cercial and Terrantejo. One of the most famous, if not the most famous vineyard on the island, Fagio dos Padres, founded by the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus back in the 16th century, has a minute 0.025 hectares of Videlio, along with some very ancient and replanted Malvasia candida, Malvasia. And access to Fagio dos Padres, famously, was by boat. Why is that? Well, when you look at the other way of getting to it, until they built the elevator, the lift, which is 300 meters down, it was a bit of a scary way to get down. The locals would hammer foot pegs into the cliff face and carry the hods of grapes up and the empty hods down. I think I'd rather go by boat. Anyway, nowadays you can go by lift. So very food friendly. It has that lovely orange peel character. If you're not a big fan of the sweeter styles of Madeira, or you're not sure you're going to be, try Videlio. It encompasses everything that is gastronomic, slightly aggressive on the palate, mouth-watering, like Cercial and Terrantejo, but also it has a certain richness to it. Have a go. What do I need to say? It's spectacular. I took these out of bottle in Corova. This is one of those things that I think are better when you open the bottle and allow oxygen in. Whilst this wine was only bottled recently, actually it still needs time. It needs oxygen. There's a funny interplay between wines that are aged oxidatively in barrel to improve them, to rearrange the various aroma and flavor compounds and the physiological texture of the wine. That very oxidative arrangement in barrel for 20, 30, 40 years. In this case, 31, something like that, 31 years. no, 30, sorry, almost 32 years. In this case, it needs further oxygenation in order to show its full potential. It's good, isn't it? Peter Morehouse, I think you're out there. Do you like it? So, here are some developments in today's trade in Madeira. IVBAN, who are the governing body, they've improved quality assurance, quality control out of sight. They may have made life a bit hard in some ways for producers, but Madeira has never been better. Improvements in estufa wines. I don't think I'm very old, but I certainly remember estufa releases that could be pretty clunky. Not anymore. So if you don't want to spend loads of money, you don't want to splash out, buy the equivalent of, let's say, a Rubio Reserve port. The same with some of the more junior estufa wines. Some of the senior estufa wines are excellent blends, and they're not cheap. Tinta Negra has been recognized, as it should have been, as a high quality grape. I've been lucky enough to taste Tinta Negra as a vintage wine back to the mid-19th century. It can be really good, and it's being recognized as such nowadays. That's another recognition. Why shouldn't the workhorse grape be recognized as more than a Dobby that carries loads? It should be recognized as calling card of the island, which it is now. The rise of Colheitas. Remember wine number 2, the Malvasia we had? What a spectacular wine that was. That's indicative of how good Colheitas are, whether they're made from Tinta Negra blends, or the noble grapes. Generic, no age declaration Madeiras, predominantly for gastronomic purposes, for cooking with, not for drinking. They're on the decrease, which can only be a good thing. They don't need to exist. And DOP Madeirense, or the table wine, the Vinho Seco, these are not really gaining traction. How do you sell those sort of wines outside of Madeira or even Portugal? It's difficult in a very competitive world of light table wine. But Madeira always has a place at the top table when it comes to fortified wine. Finally, Garrafeira and Bosqueira wines, they're the same thing, are being released a little bit younger, a minimum of 20 years. Usually they're released in reality about 25 years. In this case, in their high 20s, early 30s, the wines we're tasting this evening. But because of the supply of wine, excuse me, supply of wine not increasing, but the demand increasing, I'm afraid the age in Cantera of these Fresquera wines has had to diminish somewhat. They're still pretty ancient wines in the great scheme of things when they come to the market. But the good news is, once you've got them, and they're very affordable for what they are, you can sit on them, you can age them. There's no hurry, and they defy oxygen. They come in dark bottles, they just defy daylight, and they don't mind being knocked around a bit. Finally, the final wine, and actually by year, the oldest wine and the second sweetest style. Remember, the sweetest style we tasted as a colheita. Here we're tasting Boal, or Boal, B-U-A-L, that second most sweet style. This is also Malvasia, but known as Malvasia fina. It's a relation of Malvasia candida. It doesn't produce as much sugar in the grapes. It doesn't have that slightly saline twist that you get with Malvasia. It has more of a fruit cake nuance, medium sweet in style. Some of you might say, this is full sweet to me. In terms of the wines produced on the island, this is known as medium sweet. It still has that acidity. It tastes like fruit cake. It has that sort of Christmas cake, fruit cake, Christmas pudding, wedding cake, whatever you will, flavor to it. But it's never cloying. These are very food-friendly wine. And the late great Tim Stanley Clark, Tim Standing Joke as he was known, a very funny man, always told me I should be drinking this with fruitcake. And I agree with him. Why not? As long as there's a cup of tea nearby, just in case someone walks into the room. So very food friendly, even with savory dishes. Excellent at tea time with fruitcake, whatever other cake you like. They're perhaps a dangerous habit. And these are wines for drinking with friends on your own, perhaps in a cupboard if you have to. These are extremely age-worthy. The oldest Madeira I've ever drunk was a 1780 Boal, and it was delicious. It had been open 3 or 4 days before the tasting, and that was like this, but just an older incarnation. It was part of the Borges collection of wines that they didn't make because it's before their existence, but from their Garrafera, their family collection. So this, even though it's 33 years old, is an infant with a very long life ahead of it. Just not this particular bottle, because I'm tucking into it. So, appreciating Madeira. And look, there is the same bottle with a glass and a decanter. Best to store Madeira standing up. It has 2 things that corks don't like. High alcohol. All these wines, apart from the blend, were 20% alcohol. The blend was 19%. High alcohol doesn't do wonders for corks. They're all pretty sweet. Even the Cercial had 55 grams of residual sugar or thereabouts. And sweetness, sugar also necrotizes the cork over time, makes it fragile. So if the wine has been standing up for a long time, it's not a problem. The wine is already oxidized. If the wine has been lying down for a long time, I would probably leave it like that. Leave Madeira as it's been. If you open the bottle, particularly if it's been in bottle for 20 plus years, 30 years, 40 years, we're lucky enough, 50, 60, 70 years prior to barrel aging and time in demijohn, it's going to smell a little bit upset. It'll smell sometimes, I kid you not, a little bit sicky, overly volatile, like floor polish when it's just put on the parquet, and it could smell pretty strange. This is called bottle stink. And if you open the bottle, you don't even need to decant it necessarily, unless it's been in bottle a very long time, in which case it's best to. It'll throw a crud of sediment. Then 3 days should do it. I've seen bottles of Madeira opened and people taste them, bottles that have been stoppered up for years and years. People taste them and don't like them because they taste aggressive and high-toned and polishy. Well, surprise, surprise, they need oxygen. Good news is, those of you who like indulging yourself with glassware, you can buy more. Buy some decanters, buy some jugs, buy some claret jugs. Try unusual food combinations. Madeira isn't only about sweet foods or nuts or puddings. It's about more savory dishes. It's about game dishes. It's about strongly flavored dishes. It's about food that actually isn't really a meal. So it's about something you may just feel like nibbling at the time. So Madeira is very food friendly, terrific on its own, terrific on your own. And what I would say is honor great Madeira. Don't just slap it open and drink it. Maybe with some blends you can, but it's a drink that you should appreciate, honor, and contemplate. It might be, lucky you, at least 200 years old. Ronan, that's me. Cheers all. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Please ask me some questions. That's me, it's my website, my email address if you want me, and I'm on Instagram as well.
Hey, Demetri, thank you so much. There
are my pleasure.
In the Q&A.
Let's get on to Q&A, shall we? Let me minimize this. And remind me to stop sharing.
And I click down on the bottom on the
Q&A. I have a generic Blandy's 10-year-old that has been in the cellar for 20 years. How would it have changed over that time? It would have changed, not significantly actually, it would have changed. 10-year-olds, particularly from Blandy's, are extremely good. They are the confluence of quality and price. It's where Madeira starts to get really quite serious. It would have been quite fruity in its youthful incarnation. Now, I imagine it'll be a little bit more oxidative, because remember, 20 years under cork, even with a wax seal, means 20 years more oxygen. So give it a go. There's no point in keeping a wine like that much longer. But if you haven't got too much of it, I would perhaps drink it and see how it is. Probably at this age, if it's been in a bottle for 20 years on top of the purchase age of 10 years, decant it. See how it works after a few hours. I hope that answers your question. If I'm not answering your question, you lot, please just ask me again. Can you describe the different aromatics or flavors among the different grapes? Absolutely, I can. Cercial, I find more marmalade-y, so more orange character. I find all Madeira has orange peel character, you know, sort of slightly dried orange peel character. Boal reminds me very much of raisins, dates, figs. Malvasia has a similar thing. Fun enough, Malvasia, I find, starts off sweet and finishes quite dry on the palate. It has a sort of a zest to it, but also has something quite saline, which is funny because I can't prove this, it's anecdotal, but it is usually grown below 100 meters, 125 meters, quite close to the ocean. I hope that answers your question. A few years ago, I bought some recently bottled 1897 and 1907 Madeira. How is that possible? Absolutely, it's possible. I wonder who the producer was. It means that it's been in barrel for a very long time. That's quite normal for old Madeira. Old Madeiras, I would say, in extreme cases, will have spent a century in wood, different types of barrel. And then perhaps 20, 30 years in demijohn and then bottled. So it's unusual nowadays, but it still happens. In the past, it was quite normal. Many of the 19th century Madeiras I've had, early 19th century Madeiras, spent a century in bottle, a hell of a long time in demijohn, a long time in barrel, a long time in demijohn and barrel, or just demijohn, and then a very long time in bottle. I hope that answers your question. Certainly it's possible. Yes, any tips for opening a ready old bottle of Madeira apart from asking you along? Obviously, Adrian, the first thing to do is ask me along and I'll show you exactly how it's done. Get a butler's thief. It's one of those two prongs, it looks like a tuning fork. It has a long prong and a slightly shorter prong. And you wiggle it down the side of the cork and you gently twist and pull. Don't use a waiter's friend. Use a long, let me get rid of my Q&A banner, it's getting in the way. Don't use a waiter's friend because the pigtail is too short. Use something that has a long pigtail, in the corkscrew, the turning part of the corkscrew. And if you have got them, or you can fashion them, a pair of long tweezers. If you haven't, to get out bits of cork that may go in, if you're not going to decant, or if a bit of cork is very large, you want to decant back into the bottle for some reason, particularly if you're in the wine trade and you're doing a wine school, take a long piece of string, not garden string, because it's been soaked in creosote, take a piece of household string, tie a big knot in it, dip it into the wine, sink it below the cork, and when you pull it out, it'll take out the cork. Or if you've decanted the wine and the cork is still in there, the knot in the string will pull the cork out. There's always a way to get out bits of cork and always a way to get out a bit of cork that is crumbly in the neck of the bottle. So the two-pronged butler's thief, it's called, a long curly corkscrew, the older the better, they're usually longer, and also a bit of string with a knot in it. Any more questions? Am I scrolling down enough here? I think that's it. Ronan, have I...
yeah, are you scrolling down?
Adrian has asked the last question, I think, or is there another one?
Okay, there's, well, there's a question. There's a question from Will Lyons who says...
Sorry, there are more questions. I can go through these quickly. Is there a trend to plant more noble varieties such as Boal, Cercial, and stay a bit further away from Tinta Negra? No. There's a trend to plant more Tarantejo, probably a little bit more of the noble varieties, but Tinta Negra has been recognized as a noble variety, which it is. It can be very, very good. I hope that answers your question. In the past, Tinta Negra was treated like a workhorse. Now it's being treated more as a thoroughbred. It can be very, very good. If in doubt, and you don't want to spend too much money, go to Bovey Wines and buy a bottle of 1997 Tinta Negra Colheita. Not wildly expensive. I hope that answers your question. In terms of exactly how much they're planting, I would say that the amount of noble varieties being on the increase is probably quite small. So I think the plantings are pretty stable right now. But remember, Tinta Negra is higher cropping than the noble varieties, or now the other noble varieties. And the idea is to improve Tinta Negra, not to plant more of the other varieties. Correction to the above 1890 Verdelho and 1908 Wow. Same producer as wine 1. Yes, they would have been recently, if they were recently bottled, they would have been in barrel a hell of a long time, demijohn, and then bottled quite recently. But many times you'll find older wines than that, maybe from the early 19th century, in barrel a long time, demijohn quite a long time, and in bottle a hell of a long time. What is your favorite grape for Madeira wine? I don't really have a favorite. I like all of them. My favorite style is very old and very expensive. So buy some and invite me around. For food, if I was lucky enough to be eating a fine meal with consommé, probably Cercial. On their own, the other grapes, Mostardo, Tarantejo, Verdelho, Boal, Malvasia, but those grapes, those wines also work very well with food. But the one that works best with food, in my view, is Cercial, then Tarantejo. I've heard of Frasqueira. Why is Garrafeira different than Frasqueira? It's not. Another term for the same thing. The oldest Madeira I've ever had, hello Will, 1780, wish it was older, but it was very, very good, and it was a Boal. Do you think there'll be a rise in the Vinho Seco market, as has occurred in Hungary, with the rise of dry fumant to suit markets and create more immediate funds? It's different in Hungary. Another area I'm very fond of, and where I go and talk sometimes, fumant is a very high quality grape, and there's only so much Tokaj you can produce, or other styles of Hungarian wine made with fumant. So I think it's a no-brainer for fumant to be made in a dry style, and also Hașlevelu, it's stablemate. But when it comes to Madeira, it's such a small island, such a small production. I think actually the fortified wine production is not a problem. There's so little of it. So the Vinho Seco market is almost, well, it's doomed. I think doomed not to rise, just to be drunk on the island. It also has less of a story than dry fumant. How far in advance, hi Tim, how far in advance should you decant an Old Frasqueira Madeira? If it's been in bottle for a long time, 3 days, probably not less than that. If it's just been bottled, I would still open it a good day before. Hope that answers your question. And thanks for inviting me last year to that lovely Madeira tasting. When wines are bottled, are barrels first all blended together in a large vat, as in most places, or bottled straight from barrel? If it's a blend, obviously they're blended together. If it's a Frasqueira wine, there may only be one barrel. If there are a number of barrels, they're blended together. But what happens sometimes is they will do one release at a certain age, then they'll leave some in a different barrel, same age, and bottle it at a later date. Hope that answers your question. What would be the main evidence to identify Cercial, Verdelho, and Boal Malvasia pair in a blind tasting? Hello, wine student. Residual sugar and flavor. Cercial has the highest acidity, the lowest residual sugar, and the most biting combination of citrus notes and acidity. Malvasia and Boal have a fruitcake character. The perception of acidity is quite a lot lower. Verdelho and Cercial can be mixed up, but not so much. If you get that marmalade character without the searing acidity, slightly higher residual sugar, then Verdelho is probably it. But Cercial, I think, is the most obvious because it makes your mouth water. Hello, Peter. What temperature should we serve our Madeira? If it's been stored horizontally, carry on storing it horizontally. I think that's the best angle for Madeira, because sugar and alcohol don't do wonders for corks. And don't worry about oxygen getting in. It isn't a big problem with Madeira. Temperature, I think, old-fashioned room temperature, 18 degrees, 19 degrees would be the perfect temperature. Something a little bit chilled. For a blend, a bit cooler than that. Hope that answers your question. And I hope you liked it. What's the name of the most famous vineyard? Faja dos Padres. Faja, F-A-J-A, dos, D-O-S, Padres, P-A-D-R-E-S. Visit. It's a hell of a place. Can you, Mr. Huss or Miss Huss, please can you suggest the appropriate serving temperatures, and could you elaborate on food pairings? I've done a bit of this already, but perfect serving temperature, I think, for the Fresquera wines and the Collietas, old-fashioned room temperature, 18 degrees or so. I think if you like broths and soups, consommé, then Cercial is great. Anything savory will work with Verdelho, Terrantejo, and Cercial. Sweeter dishes or light eats work very well with Boal and Malvasia, but experiment. I think game works very, very well, particularly very rich game dishes would work very well with the sweeter wines too. But the drier wines, I think, work better on the whole with more savory dishes than the sweeter wines. But I think the sweeter wines are unparalleled when it comes to enjoying them on their own. You can drink them with cheese, you can drink them on their own, you can drink them with a few nuts. I think cheese, particularly hard cheese, is a wonderful pairing for all Madeira. Hope that helps. Commercial appeal of Madeira versus port or sherry. Madeira demand seems to be on the rise, not similar for port or sherry. Not sure I totally agree with that. I would say that Madeira is insignificant compared to the other two commercially. And the production is so small. The greatest production of Madeira that we can kiss goodbye to is the unaged Madeira. So that's a step in the right direction. Madeira is definitely on the increase in quality. Port is also on the increase in quality. We find cheaper ports that mainly go to the French market or have done in the past are dying away. However, in this country, port sales haven't been this good for ages, particularly at the top level. So I would say that we're noticing this with increased sales of Tawny Port, which is a great introduction to the styles of bottle-aged ports like vintage port and crusted port that we want people to buy. Sherry is perhaps the area where more and more people are getting on the bandwagon because so much is produced. There are so many different styles. There are limits. There's a limit to the styles available on Madeira and a limit to the production. So at the top level, port, Madeira, and sherry are getting better. In terms of the bottom level, the market is contracting, which can really be a good thing. But I would say that more people are drinking dry sherry now than I've seen since I remember. I hope that answers your question. It's mainly one of production quantity. Hi, Leslie. Thanks very much for the wines. 1899 Terrantejo arriving soon. Super exciting. Not sure this is excessive advertising on your part. It really isn't. No, you should shout about that. I've had some 19th century Terrantejo in the past, and they are spectacular. And I hope people viewing will buy a bit of that. Suggested cheese pairings. I'm a big fan of Comte, and I'm a big fan of Emmental, sometimes of really good cheddar. And I think Cercial and really good acidic cheddar are a match made in heaven. I think all Madeira and hard cheeses go very well together. I would say the drier tasting Madeiras work well with creamy goat's cheeses. I think really rich, ripe, hard cheeses also work well with the sweeter Madeiras, like they would with tawny and vintage port. Experiment in the same way as you would with port. But I hope that works for you. But try any pairing. I would say blue cheese and Malvasia is a match made in heaven. And let's face it, blue cheese annihilates many wines. It doesn't stand a chance against a good Malvasia. Do you think the style of wine has a future or will disappear? I take your point. I don't think the dry wines are going to gain much traction because there's too much worldwide competition and there's not enough of a story there, but there's a great story with these. And I would say they're increasingly becoming the preserve of those who really, really appreciate them because they're made in tiny quantities. Remember, Tarantej, 2,000 litres produced a year. Gosh, nothing at all. So it has a future for those who appreciate it. I hope that helps. Luis, my understanding from Luis Talavera, Humberto Jardim, Henriques and Henriques, is that Colheita Fresqueiras only improve while aging in wood via Cantero. To what extent and how have you seen these change with more time in bottle? No, I don't accept that. I think Madeira changes a great deal in bottle. Of course, it changes the most in wood, but if you've tasted a 19th century or 18th century Madeira that's been in bottle for 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years, yeah, they will taste very different from the way they would have tasted when they were released. And I've tasted the same wine released a couple of decades apart, and they do taste subtly different. Because remember, even in bottle, there's an element of oxidation through cork. I hope that answers your question. So what is the name of the most famous vineyard? Faja dos Padres. Faja dos Padres. What is your favorite style of Madeira? I think we've been through that. I love them all, as long as they're good, old, and they go with the way I feel. I think we've done that. Hi, Alex. Thank you. Very return to Big Fortified Tasting. Yes, the Big Fortified Tasting would have been today, St. George's Day, but because of this boring disorder, we're all locked down. And rainwater, Olivia, is a style of wine that is almost extinct, that was mainly made, and still is, from Tinta Negra, allegedly from rainwater flowing into the butt. And this slightly diluted style of Madeira for immediate consumption became very well known in the colonies, in the nascent USA. It was known as East Side on occasion. Hello, Adrian. Hello. Thank you very much for your comments. I think we've been through those. Great. I think I've covered all of them.
Hey, Demetri, thank you so much. That was an amazingly detailed presentation, elegantly presented. You obviously got a very amazing passion for fortified wines. My question to you is, will you come back and do port?
Absolutely, I will. Yes, please.
Right. A lot of people are saying how much they enjoyed it and how much they enjoyed your presentation skills. So please, that would be fantastic.
And thank you all for your questions. And forgive me if I haven't answered them to the way you would like it, but email me. Cheers all. Happy St. George's Day. And thank you, 67 Pall Mall.
Happy St. George's Day. And thank you so much, Demetri.
Thank you. Cheers.